Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at a side of animal ethics that maybe doesn't get as much airtime.
Hmm,
We often think, factory farms, animal testing, but we're diving into the wild animal suffering.
exactly. It's this huge area. We tend to focus on human-caused harm, right?
Right.
But these two sources we have today, Cassia Furria's Animal Ethics in the Wild and Kyle Johansson's Wild Animal Ethics, they really push us. They make us consider the ethics of nature itself.
Yeah, and the suffering that just happens there
Yeah.
naturally.
Hmm. Widespread hardship from natural causes.
So we've got these two pretty academic books. Foria looks at the fundamental reasons we should care, maybe even intervene.
And Johansson digs into the moral, even political side of it. He explores some pretty surprising potential solutions, too.
Okay, so for everyone listening, our goal here is to unpack their main ideas, explore these big ethical questions, and just get a really solid handle on what this all means. It's a challenging topic.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the first thing that hits you, something both Ferreira and Johansson stress, is just the sheer scale of the suffering we might be talking about.
Right. The vast majority of animals on Earth live in the wild.
And their lives were often,
Yeah.
well, full of threats, and often short,
Mm-hmm.
and end badly.
Okay, let's try and picture that. What's the day-to-day like?
Well, imagine constantly being on the lookout for predators,
Yeah.
battling hunger, maybe starvation. Disease is a constant risk.
And things like floods, fires, freezing weather.
Exactly. Extreme conditions. And wild animals often have, very little capacity to cope compared to us, or even domestic animals.
So Farah and Johansson both paint this picture. Lots of animals born, very few survive.
That seems to be the reality for many species, especially those with lots of offspring. Think insects, fish, amphibians. Huge numbers born. Most die very young, often painfully.
Starvation, getting eaten.
Yeah. Short lives, often filled with struggle, ending harshly. It's
Yeah.
just the natural cycle for many.
So for listeners wanting the quick takeaway, this really widens the lens on animal welfare, doesn't it? It's not just about the animals we directly impact.
Precisely. It forces a much broader view.
Oh.
And that leads us straight into the core argument for maybe doing something about it. Faria lays this out really clearly.
What's the logic there?
It's quite powerful, actually. She basically says, look, if we feel an obligation to help humans who are suffering, say, after an earthquake or from a disease,
Yeah, of course.
then why should that obligation stop just because the individual suffering belongs to a different species, especially if the suffering is comparable?
So the cause, natural or human, shouldn't matter, and the species shouldn't matter, only the suffering itself.
That's the core of her argument. If suffering is bad, it's bad regardless of who is experiencing it or what caused it, provided we can actually help effectively.
And Johansson picks up on this too.
He does. He argues we might actually have a positive duty, an obligation to research safe ways to provide large-scale assistance. He's not saying charge in recklessly.
Right, that sounds potentially disastrous.
Exactly. He acknowledges the massive risks and complexities. But he argues the moral weight of all that suffering means we have to at least investigate possibilities seriously.
Okay, so they're building on existing ethical ideas.
Very much so. Furia, in her book, takes general moral arguments we already accept for protecting animals from harm, arguments about sentience, the capacity to suffer, and just applies them consistently to animals in the wild.
It seems like a logical step, but one we don't often take.
It is. And she brings up speciesism here, too.
The idea that we unfairly favor our own species.
Yeah. Furia asks, is our reluctance to get involved in wild suffering partly down to this bias? Why does a suffering puppy pull our heartstrings more than, say, a starving fawn if their suffering is potentially equivalent? It's a challenging question.
Definitely. Now, Johansson adds another dimension, thinking about how we value nature itself.
Right. This is a big one. Many people feel strongly that we should leave nature alone, that interfering is wrong, maybe even arrogant.
That intervention might somehow disrespect nature or damage its value.
Exactly. Johansson tackles this head on. How do we balance a potential duty to reduce suffering with respect for natural processes, ecosystems, wilderness? It's a core tension.
And he talks about a collective obligation. What does that mean?
He suggests this isn't just about you or me deciding to help an individual animal we find. It's potentially a larger societal responsibility.
Like something governments or big organizations should be involved in?
Kind of. He frames it as needing organized, funded research and potentially, eventually, coordinated action. It's about treating it as a serious, large-scale problem that requires institutional effort.
Even brings up justice, right? Justice for wild animals.
Yes, extending concepts of justice beyond humans, suggesting that maybe sentient beings in the wild are owed certain considerations, certain kinds of aid, simply because they can suffer and have interests.
Okay, this is obviously controversial. The whole idea of intervening in nature on a large scale. People must raise objections.
Oh, absolutely. And both authors are very aware of this. Foria especially spends a lot of time systematically addressing the counterarguments.
What are the main worries people have?
Well, Foria categorizes them. One big one is just futility. The scale is so vast, nature is so complex, maybe anything we try is just a drop in the ocean, doomed to fail.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Then there's jeopardy. This is a really serious one. The fear that our interventions, even with good intentions, could backfire badly.
How so?
We could mess up ecosystems in ways we didn't foresee, harm the very animals we're trying to help, or cause knock-on effects that create even more problems down the line. Think introducing a species to control another, and it goes haywire.
Yeah, ecological interventions have a rocky history sometimes.
They do. And related to that is perversity. The idea that our actions could unintentionally lead to outcomes that are the opposite of what we wanted, maybe even worse than the original situation.
Like trying to reduce predation actually leads to mass starvation because the prey population explodes.
Something like that, yeah. These aren't trivial concerns. They're major hurdles, and Foria really methodically works through why she thinks they might not be absolute showstoppers, at least not for exploring options.
So, assuming for a moment we could overcome these objections, what would intervention even look like? Johansson explores some specific ideas.
He does. And some are quite futuristic, maybe, like genetic editing.
Genetic editing in wild animals. Wow, how would that work?
Well, the idea Johansson floats is that maybe, way down the line, it could offer targeted solutions that don't require constant meddling.
Less hands-on interference.
Potentially. He discusses things like, could we gradually edit genes to reduce susceptibility to certain horrible diseases? Or maybe even tweak reproductive strategies to lessen the sheer number of offspring who die incredibly young.
So, building resilience into the animals themselves, rather than constantly managing their environment.
That's the kind of long-term speculative possibility he explores. It's aimed at finding ways to help that might be more sustainable and less intrusive than perpetual management.
But he also tackles more immediate, ethically thorny issues.
Yes, he discusses the really difficult ethics around things like, should we control predator populations in some areas to reduce prey suffering?
Whoa.
Or modifying reproduction directly, as we mentioned, to reduce those massive early death tolls. These are obviously hugely complex questions with profound ethical implications. No easy answers there.
Definitely not. So, stepping back, what does all this mean for, say, environmentalism or how animal advocates think?
It could be quite disruptive, actually. Johansson points out how this focus on individual sentient experience challenges some traditional conservation views.
How so?
Well, conservation biology often focuses on the health of populations, species, ecosystems. Sometimes actions taken for the greater good of the ecosystem might actually cause significant suffering to individual animals within it.
Like culling an overpopulated species, maybe?
Or reintroducing predators, which is good for the ecosystem balance, but obviously involves intense suffering for the prey. This perspective forces us to weigh individual well-being more heavily, potentially.
It really forces a rethink, doesn't it? Faria's work especially seems to be saying, if we care about suffering, we need to care about it everywhere, not just when humans are the cause or the victim is cute.
Exactly. It's a call for consistency in our ethical commitments to all sentient life, regardless of where they live or how they look.
But given all the complexities, the risks, where do they land on what we should do now?
Both authors come back strongly to the need for more research. Lots more research.
Research into what, specifically?
Two main things, really. First, just understanding wild animal suffering better. How extensive is it? What are the main causes in different ecosystems? How do different animals actually experience their lives? We know surprisingly little about the subjective experiences of many wild animals.
And the second thing?
Research into potential interventions, but careful research. Developing and rigorously testing ways to help, ensuring they are genuinely safe, effective, and don't cause those dreaded unintended consequences.
So it's not a call for immediate large-scale action, but for serious investigation.
Precisely. It's acknowledging the problem is huge and ethically significant, but also that intervening is incredibly complex and potentially dangerous, so we need to proceed with extreme caution and gather much more information.
Okay, so wrapping this up for our listeners. we're basically left with this big, uncomfortable tension, right?
Definitely. It's the ethical push to alleviate suffering versus that long-held, very understandable intuition to just leave nature alone. Don't meddle.
Yeah. And it's a tough one to resolve.
It is. But I think the key takeaway from both Faria and Johansson is undeniable.
Hmm.
Wild animal suffering is a serious ethical issue. The sheer potential scale of it means we can't just ignore it anymore. It deserves way more attention.
It certainly makes you think differently about the natural world. So, maybe a final thought to leave everyone with as we learn more and more about animal sentience, about the capacity of so many different creatures to feel pain, fear, stress, and we recognize how much of that happens just naturally. If we actually develop the technology, the knowledge to safely and effectively reduce some of that wild suffering, could we ethically choose not to? What does living in harmony with nature really mean if harmony involves passively witnessing immense suffering that we could potentially alleviate? It maybe pushes us to reconsider what our responsibilities truly are.
A challenging thought to end on.
Indeed. Thanks for exploring this deep dive with us.